It's always good to be back in Orlando and to be back in a group like this, the only demand sensing conference. I remember when I first wrote on the concept of demand sensing in 2005 when I was an AMR analyst, and it's great to have a room full of people interested. The other thing is, many of you are new at this conference. I haven't seen your faces before, and I think that the industry in general has gone through more reorganization than I've seen in my years of coverage as an analyst. And today what I want to do is to give you some grounding on what is demand sensing, how does it fit in the world of supply chain excellence, and what can we learn from the past to take forward for the future. So the other thing is I just finished a book called Metrics That Matter, and I think this is about creating value. And if we look at slowing growth and we look at where companies are at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns, I think you are missionaries of driving value. And this concept around demand driven, right, is one that I've written about for a decade, and I don't think it's very well understood, so I'm going to ground you in my perspectives of demand driven. And one of the interesting things is when I say demand driven, most people will say, well, yeah, I need to work on that forecast, right? That's not my perspective. To me, being demand-driven is driving outside-in processes. And our historic processes are inside-out. Our historic processes are based upon order and shipment data. We catch order and shipment data, and we don't really understand a concept I'm going to call demand latency. The time for shelf takeaway to translate to an order so that it can be really responded to by the supply chain. And with the lengthening of the tail of the supply chain as we've added more items, demand latency has increased and demand volatility is much higher than when I used to manage supply chains in 1980. A tremendous difference. But let's get started. So I got introduced, right? I got introduced as a consultant. I don't consider myself a consultant. I'm an industry analyst. And by that, I never implement software. And I'm also known as straight talk and independent. Right? This morning, I took a hard stance against SAP HANA. Can only find 2 references that are really making progress. And it's tough sledding. There's a lot of co-development. I don't think that SAP HANA is where it is based upon the hype in the market. And I said, buyer beware. It's only for those that have strong SAP skills and can do co-development. So I'm a critic. I take hard stance against vendors. I'm also a curmudgeon of sorts, right? So you'll see me writing and I'll take a stance, and I want to engage audiences like you. I want to have active debate about how we drive and improve supply chain excellence, because supply chain is 30 years old, right? 1982 was the first time that source, make, and deliver were really put together in a concept called supply chain management. We're still very young in the evolution of supply chain understanding. And I find many times companies are stalled because they're not clear on what is supply chain excellence. So I'm a curmudgeon. I take hard stance. Sort of a fortune teller. So I'll tell you a little bit about where I see the market going. But it's very research-based. I do about 40 quantitative studies a year. You'll see me on LinkedIn, you'll see me on Twitter. I may send you an email asking for a study. If you answer my study, I never reveal your name, but I use it to try to help others to understand this world and this journey of supply chain management that we're on together. So let's get started. My reference. 2012 was the 30th anniversary of supply chain management, and I wrote my first book. I had just left AMR with the acquisition of Gartner because I don't believe in the Gartner methodology. I'd been a Gartner analyst before, and I decided that I was going to leave and start my own business. And that was a hard decision. And I had signed a contract to write this book, Bricks Matter, and I'd worked with about 600 companies on the improvement of supply chain. I go to conference after conference and see speaker after speaker stand on stage, and they put their shoulders back, and you've seen it too. They've saved money, they've improved inventory, they've improved customer service, and I wanted to write their stories. So I took the 600 companies that I'd worked with at AMR, and I went to the balance sheet and I said, what improvement have we made in supply chain management? I was really, really frustrated. The companies that I had worked with that I thought had done so well were stalled. They were stalled at the intersection of operating margin and inventory turns. So I printed everyone's balance sheets, every public company in the world, and I put them in two piles. The first pile represented companies that had made improvement in perhaps one of the two metrics, operating margin or inventory turns, or not at all. And the second pile represented the companies that had made progress over the last decade in both operating margin and inventory turns. I found 9/10 of companies were stalled and 1/10 of companies were making progress. And so that really started me thinking about what is supply chain management? What is supply chain excellence? Where are we on our journey? And on the way, I've written about 700 posts now in the Supply Chain Shaman. And this is an annual softback book that I write, which are my best read blog posts. And I write weekly, and I try to engage with readers, and it's very research-based. And the book that Rob has purchased for you today is my latest book called Metrics That Matter. And I'm going to talk about this book, and it starts with a story. And the story is probably one that you've lived. It's about a guy by the name of Joe. And Joe was a real character that I engaged as an analyst. And Joe was having a global supply chain meeting, and his CFO had asked him to reduce inventory. Joe was a good soldier, and so he said, "Yes, sir, I'll take that 20% reduction in inventory." But when he told his team, they were very dismayed. They had just outsourced a lot of manufacturing. They were really struggling with customer service. They'd cut inventory before, and they had had a lot of issues. And so Joe announced that they were going to have this big, hairy, audacious goal to reduce inventory without really thinking about inventory as a buffer and the potential of inventory in the supply chain and how he needed to drive supply chain excellence. Joe was surrounded by what people thought were supply chain experts. On his board was a CFO who had come from GE, and he thought he knew really well what supply chain excellence was. And a sales guy had come from Procter & Gamble, and he was sure he knew what supply chain excellence was. And his COO had worked at lean Toyota systems, and he believed he knew what supply chain excellence was. But like most organizations, these leaders were not aligned, and those are very different principles. And what they do is they have a discussion in the book around supply chain excellence, the metrics that matter, and what we can learn in the journey. So let me tell you about the journey, because I want to get you prepared, right? I want to be sure that you can make the leap from what I call the old-fashioned supply chain of inside out to outside in, the one that can really embrace digital, mobile, Internet of Things, cognitive reasoning, artificial intelligence, new technologies that are coming at us that allow the supply chain to sense. Today, the supply chain cannot sense. It can only respond, and it responds very late with a latent signal. I believe we're on a revolution, not an evolution of supply chain technology. I believe we're entering the third act of supply chain technology. The first act was all about deterministic optimization. It was the best-of-breed world where we first started using supply chain planning, and many of you use those planning systems today. And then we entered the second act, where we believed we'd have a tightly integrated supply chain, and that tight integration would lead us to greatness, and it actually took us backwards. Now we're on to the third evolution, where we're going to see new forms of analytics, and Rob is part of this journey, where we're able to see patterns, and we're translating patterns, and we're able to better respond. Along the way, I think we have to learn new practices, like what is demand sensing, and how do we reduce demand latency? And we've got to be missionaries to learn from the past, to unlearn, to relearn. And that's my message, and here's why I believe that. Remember that pile of corporate balance sheets? 9 out of 10 companies are stuck, not making improvement at operating margin and inventory turns. This is from a study that I did on how do supply chain leaders describe their supply chain, right? Look at this slide, right? I asked people to pick the adjectives that best describe their supply chain. You can see most think it's traditional. It's reactive. It's cautious. Oh my gosh, room for improvement, right? But it isn't aligned. It isn't proactive. It isn't agile. And that's really what we want. We want that balance. And when we look at the last decade, and we hear all the consultants talk about best practices, I want you to be a critic in your own right. I want you to remember this slide. There are 5 things I want you to get from this slide, and it's an eye chart. First of all, every industry is different. So a methodology like the Gartner Top 25, where I put all companies in a spreadsheet and shake them up, doesn't help us very much. Secondly, look at revenue per employee and the improvement we made on revenue per employee. We made our employees much more productive. But look at the translation to operating margin. That's not a good story, right, across the industries. Certain industries like hospitals are very young, and you can see they've made some recent improvements. Consumer packaged goods is a very mature industry, and by and large, it's flat. And it's having difficulties actually raising the bar on this complex system. That's the second thing. We've improved revenue per employee, have not translated to operating margin. Third thing, look at that cash to cash number, right? You know that you want to have good cash to cash. And you may feel really good about that. But what we've really done is we've lengthened payables, because cash to cash is a combination of receivables, inventory, and payables. We've lengthened payables, and we've pushed cost and waste back on our supply base. And we have one of the weakest supply bases that I've ever seen in supply chain. But all of those supposed savings in inventory, look at the results. Not all industries are making progress, and when we are, and this is from the last decade, it's 2 or 3%, right? Inventory, which is the most important buffer in the supply chain, is even more difficult to manage. So when you hear people talk, my fourth point, about supply chain improvement, we have to manage a portfolio of metrics that are non-linear in the relationships, can't really be managed on an Excel spreadsheet, and we've got to manage them together against an operating strategy. And that's really tough. The fifth thing is growth has slowed, and supply chain matters more than ever. I have financial analysts call me now to ask about supply chain programs for companies like yours. They want to know, is Kellogg going to be successful in ERP on their 3rd time? They want to know what's really going to happen with the Kraft Heinz acquisition. I've never had those calls before. Growth has slowed, supply chain matters more than ever. The rhythms and cycles of every industry are different. And what we're doing is we're managing the supply chain as a complex system. Now, why is it important? Well, supply chain risk, write-offs, material events, the supply chain as a global multinational matters more than ever. When we look at the past 5 years versus the future 5 years, and we ask supply chain leaders where we are on risk, look at the left-hand side where you can see supply chain visibility. The size of the bubble means the importance. You can see supply chain visibility. We've done a lot of work there. People are feeling pretty good, still important. But take supplier viability. Our suppliers are weak. Take demand variability. Look at the size of the bubble of demand variability. Demand variability and volatility is increased, and it's kind of the silent killer of the supply chain. And it isn't about just measuring forecast accuracy or bias. It is about how we translate that demand and learn to use the probability of demand. We have to rethink all of our processes around demand management. It isn't just as simple as a forecast. And so when you think about risk and you think about performance, supply chain is at the thrust. And I'm sure all of you have played the game called the beer game, not the one that you might have played in the frat house in college, but the one that's the experiential game around the bullwhip effect, right? At usage, demand is very predictable. The translation of the demand from usage through the channel amplifies and distorts the signal so that when the manufacturer gets the order is such a poor representation of demand. And this is the basis of demand-driven. Is how do we use independent demand across source, make, and deliver, not dependent demand. The consumption of the forecast based upon the traditional definition of applied planning systems basically took independent demand and converted it to dependent demand and amplified the signal even more. So as we think about demand sensing, we're able to translate independent demand in a short-term horizon to be able to reduce demand latency. I've written about this for a decade, but the number one question I get by Terra technology users or executives of Terra technology users is, what does demand sensing mean? It's a reduction of demand latency to improve the response of the supply chain and to decrease the impact of the bullwhip effect, which is demonstrated by this slide. So as we think about demand-driven concepts, I've been writing across the decade, there are lots of definitions of demand-driven, and one of the fights I used to have with Tony Friscia, who is the CEO of AMR, was we never trademarked or patented the definitions of demand-driven that we wrote about. We got a lot of insights from Procter & Gamble on their consumer-driven supply networks. And then we wrote about demand-driven networks and demand-driven value networks. And in my book, Bricks Matter, I write about market-driven value networks. But the concept is it's outside in. It's not translating forecasts based upon order consumption logic. Instead, it's about sensing market patterns and translating them. Market-driven is bidirectional, allowing you to orchestrate market to market. Let me give you an example. There are 197 ways to cut up a cow. So I work with a company that basically looks at what cows they have in the lots and how they're going to sell in the beef case, and they make the decisions about how to actually manufacture their beef products. Most promotions are based upon history. I was in the market the other day and I saw pecan sandies, buy one, get one free. With the cost of pecans, they're losing money on that. But because we don't orchestrate end to end, because we're very functional, we can't really translate buy, source, and deliver decisions together outside in. So why are we stuck? The number one fallacy was we believed if we had functional excellence, we were the best at transportation, the best at manufacturing, the best at procurement, and the best at distribution, that each of the functions would win and A plus B plus C plus D would equal excellence. Not so. The functions are not designed to work together. Procurement will buy the lowest cost product, which may not lead to the total best cost. Transportation will want to fill up every truck irrespective of the customer service signal. Manufacturing will operate on the best return on asset. Only 12% of companies today can see total cost. So the ability to work across functions is problematic. That's number one reason why we're stuck. The second reason we're stuck is we've had all these projects, right? And we had a belief that if each project met a threshold for return on investment, that project A plus project B plus project C would deliver greatness. And that is also not true, because companies lack a clear definition of what is supply chain excellence. So when I wrote the book, Bricks Matter, this is what I expected to talk about. I expected to be able to tell the story how companies had improved operating margin and inventory turns and lifted the potential of the supply chain. But I couldn't tell that story because the supply chain is a complex system with complex processes with increasing complexity, and we haven't owned it as a complex system. What do I mean by that? Well, it's a combination of complexity, which item complexity, product complexity, manufacturing complexity, coupled with cycles, cash-to-cash cycles, manufacturing cycles, inventory cycles, with profitability considerations, with growth. And we balance this, or we should. And we should make conscious trade-offs across the functions, or we should. And that requires strong horizontal processes and requires a clear understanding of operating excellence. And it does deliver value, because when we look at the correlation of the ratios to market capitalization, we can clearly see that inventory and cash and the things that we work on have a clear correlation to market cap. But let's look at the real results, right? This is what I call orbit charts. And in the book that you're going to see today, I actually look at each industry, I look at industry leaders, and I look at their progress, right? They didn't make that transition to greatness. This is Walmart. Walmart's the best there is in retail, but they've primarily improved inventory. And an orbit chart, what I'm doing is I'm showing you the transition year over year at the intersection of inventory turns and operating margin. So Walmart, a supply chain leader, didn't make my list for the supply chains to admire because they are not outperforming on a portfolio. This is Apple, right? Again, Apple is one dimension really headed in around operating margin, right? And this is Dow Chemical. Now, Dow Chemical is in the Gartner Top 25. They're about at the same place in 2003 that they started at in 2000. Many of your companies are very similar. We've gone on this meandering path, believing that we're pushing supply chain excellence, believing that if I have the best functions that greatness will happen, believing if I have every project to meet a threshold or return on investment, greatness would happen. But what happens is companies don't manage this as a complex system. They're not managing the portfolio. This is Mattel, right? This is probably a lot like you. And this is Procter & Gamble. Now, I love the Procter & Gamble story. I've worked with Procter & Gamble. I'm proud that I started out as a Procter & Gamble employee. But look at the journey of Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble did phenomenal work around manufacturing excellence, the IWS projects, making a lot of progress around the first decade. One of the earliest companies to put source, make, deliver under the same leader. But complexity rose, right? They lost balance. They continued to make progress on inventory turns because of focus, but they went backwards in operating margin. It's the balance of complexity, inventory turns, and operating margin. And now we've seen a shift where they're starting to make progress again under Lafley and some of the work they're doing on complexity. We've also talked about value networks, right? Everybody's been to those conferences where we collaborate and we improve value and kumbaya. But I say we really haven't collaborated. We really haven't come together to drive real value. We've shared data. We've talked a lot about it. But look at the individual players on this graph. Each of these players represents the best in their respective industry on making progress. Colgate has outperformed the industry on return on invested capital, operating margin. They've slipped a little bit on inventory in the last couple years. But there's Colgate. Hershey did a remarkable turnaround when they were threatened by the board, and Jason Ryman's been doing some incredible work. BASF has also done some incredible work. Walmart's up in the corner, and look at VF, the green line, right? These are the patterns of these companies, right? Can you say from this graph that we've done great things in the value chain? I don't think so. If we had really been working on driving the product portfolios, our true end-to-end value propositions, I think we would see a pattern where all parties were winning, where all parties were driving improvements. But that's not the case. So I developed a methodology. I ranked every public company on were they making improvement based upon the supply chain index. I mapped the orbit charts at the intersection of growth and return on invested capital, inventory turns and operating margin, and I looked at how resilient they were. Were they a pattern like Mattel or Dow where they went all over the place? Or were they a tight pattern of supply chain improvement? And I came up with 21 companies that really were making improvement. And then I looked at performance. Was the company making improvement? And were they driving performance above their peer group on return on invested capital, inventory turns, operating margin, and return on invested capital? And I came up with this methodology, which I call the supply chains to admire. And this is the food group, right? Now, when you look at this, and it's a little bit of an eye chart, I want you to think, who has done supply chain best, right? So Campbell's was driving a lot of improvement until they stubbed their toe on their recent SAP project. And they went from relative improvement to really difficult improvement. And I think General Mills has done the best, right? If you look at General Mills on performance versus their peer group, you can see all three of those metrics. They're performing better than their peer group. But also on the index, on improvement, they may not be number one, but they're in the middle of the stack. They're driving improvement. So I believe supply chain excellence is when you perform better than your peer group on the portfolio of metrics and you drive improvement at the intersection of the metrics. And for that, I wrote the supply chains to admire. And these are the companies for the last decade that have shown both improvement and they outperform on those metrics of operating margin, inventory turns, and return on invested capital. And I think they're important metrics because of the correlation to market capitalization. Now, when you look at this, there are a couple of things I want you to take away. Number one, there's no pharma company here, right? No pharma company made the list. Number two, there's no retail company. Retailers didn't make the list because I couldn't find a retailer making improvement at that intersection. There are more companies in the high-tech industry than in the process industries, despite the fact that there's higher volatility, shorter life cycles, and greater inventory obstacles or challenges in the high-tech industry than the process industries. Well, why did they make the list? They're just better at supply chain planning. Supply chain matters more. If you're not good at supply chain in the high-tech industries, you don't stay in business, right? Whereas in consumer packaged goods, you know, it doesn't matter as much. And in the world of high-margin products, it's really hard to build a guiding coalition. But we can learn a lot from the high-tech industries around why planning matters, supply chain visibility, supply chain analytics, and driving supply chain improvements. And it's also a useful exercise for you to do orbit charts of your divisions or your comparative companies and see, are you able to drive a portfolio for improvement? This came from a recent engagement where I was taking 3 functions and I was plotting them, and you can see one has made a lot of improvement on inventory, not on cost. One has never recovered from the recession, and the other company is making slight improvements. It's a very different view. And it's a helpful view for talking to finance because they're so used to looking at these metrics in Excel spreadsheets without looking at the patterns. And the patterns matter because I think it's how we drive results. The supply chain is a complex system. We have to manage the portfolio, and we have to define supply chain excellence. So in the companies that I see that are driving improvement and outperform, I see a couple of different characteristics. One, leadership. A company that spends time to develop operating excellence and what it means. Now you might say, well, Laura, isn't that stupid? Doesn't everybody know what supply chain excellence means? No. And everyone in the industry has a different perspective. And the fit of supply chain excellence is different based upon the rhythms and cycles of the supply chain. The first thing that a company should do is define what does operating excellence mean and why. When I wrote about the Kraft-Heinz merger, I said those are two very different organizations with different perspectives on supply chain excellence, and the first thing they should do is define what it means. Look at what's happened to Del Monte. That's a good example of a lack of definition of operating excellence in the merger. Second is building of talent, right? We have never had more turnover in the supply chain than I've seen recently. We've lost a lot of knowledge. We have shortage of mid-management talent. Today it takes 5 to 6 months to replace a demand planning or a supply planning job. Talent is tight. Companies with analytic skills, with understanding of supply chain, is tough. And we're early in the building of outside-in processes. And people are going to ask you, like, why does demand sensing make so much difference? And what is an outside-in process? And why can't we just rely on orders and shipments? And you're going to have to explain to them about the long tail of the supply chain and demand latency. And you're going to have to describe it in what I call business talk, not the wonk, wonk, wonk talk that we often have of supply chain acronyms and supply chain nuances. We've got to talk the language of business. And it's about building horizontal processes of revenue management, sales and operations planning, supplier development, corporate social responsibility, and getting up out of the functions. It's about design. And it's about being good at supply chain planning. But if we look at supply chain by the numbers, we're still very early in this evolution. 30 years is not that long. I worked in manufacturing when there was not a supply chain organization. But today, there are 7 functions that typically report to the supply chain organization. And in about half of organizations, you'll have manufacturing and procurement reporting to the same organization. I actually see that the companies that are able to drive improvement on operating margin and inventory turns have source, make, and deliver reporting through the same organization. I believe it matters. I see 11% improvement in inventory when I see that kind of reporting structure. When the functions are not aligned, it is very hard to balance that complex system. Now, we're starting to have reporting structures at a higher level in the organization. So you can see the evolution of the Chief Supply Chain Officer and also a Center of Excellence. About 1/3 of companies have a Supply Chain Center of Excellence, and that sounds like a good thing. But 50% are failing. And they're failing because we're not able to rationalize that operating strategy and create the compelling mission for supply chain as it ties to value. And we're not able to define global regional governance, right? I laugh because I have lots of consultants that come in with my new buzzwords. I think the new one's globalization, we're going to take the global to the region. Okay, enough now. We just have to define governance, right? What is the role of the region and what is the role of global? And we have to define the center of excellence so it can drive improvement. The 3 characteristics I see for the center of excellence when it drives improvement is it takes ownership of talent. This is from a recent talent study. And look at the inability to get jobs. The supply chain execution jobs are pretty easy to fill. The supply chain planning jobs are tough to fill. So one of the characteristics of the Supply Chain Center of Excellence that makes them successful is when they take ownership of talent, writing job descriptions, helping with career paths, helping with training, helping people to understand why planning matters. Because if I ask people how they're doing on talent, this is a year-over-year tracking study, and I say, how are you doing against your peers on talent? We aren't doing so well, right? The people in this study rate themselves worse and worse and worse. Because talent is changing. I was a first-generation supply chain pioneer. I'm a gray hair. Most of my peers have retired. And then we had the second generation of talent, which some are in this room. And they carried the torch to build the global multinationals. And many of them are retiring. And now we have the third generation of talent. And they come to the market believing that we have best practices. And I want to say, you got to carry the torch and carry us onward, really looking at the evolution of these practices and building talent. Talent's important. And when we say in the study, what are the problems? Look at the ability to adopt new ways of working. Demand sensing is a new way of working. It's hard for some people to accept that they might need demand sensing. Why does not getting the order and demand consumption logic work? Well, that's what we've done for years. Well, demand is changing. Technologies are changing. We need to build talent that can really be able to come to grips with our new technologies and our new ways of working. The second issue is the lack of a career path, right? Millennials want a career path. And that's tough because supply chain processes are evolving, but it's real. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the current state of IT systems. When I was a Gartner analyst in 2001 to 2003, we believed that we would have one ERP system and we would connect advanced planning to ERP. And all would be right with the world. But we've gone through 2,700 mergers and acquisitions in the industry. And most companies have 5 to 7 ERP systems, and they have 2 to 3 APS systems or advanced planning systems. So we've got a lot of stuff. And you can see across the survey that we've got a lot of stuff. And the role of ERP as a transactional system of record, we would not be able to have global multinationals the way we do today without ERP. But ERP is a poor foundation for planning. It's okay as a system of record, but the concept of the tight integration of advanced planning to ERP was flawed. And if we look at current satisfaction levels with technologies, you can see we're not very happy with our planning systems, which is why I think we're entering the third act of planning. Now, I did a recent study where I compared best-of-breed providers to what I call ERP expansionists. And ERP expansionists are companies like Oracle and SAP that built systems on top of ERP systems. And the best-of-breed providers were folks like Kinaxis and JDA and Agility and Terra technology. And I did this for about 183 instances. And if you contributed to the study, thank you very much. And I continue to look for correlations. And the first thing I said was, where are companies the happiest? And when the number's in red, it represents a 90% confidence interval. Statistically significant. So the companies were the happiest when it was implemented by the technology provider. It took less time to implement. When it was best of breed, there was a higher return on investment. And there was also higher satisfaction. So I hear a lot of arguments about, I'm going to have one system from one vendor, and I'm going to have one throat to choke, and I'm going to have an integrated supply chain. And I think that term integrated supply chain, we've let get out of hand, right? The best-of-breed providers integrate just as well as SAP integrates to APO. We have to look at value. The world of technology is moving at a cycle, and the world of the business is moving at a cycle. And I come to you today to say, delivering value to the business is important. And I think it's more important than fighting about IT standardization. And with the role of the cloud and the ability to take applications to the cloud, I think the license model is no longer as relevant, and the argument of IT standardization is more mute. And I think we've got to look at history and say, where did we drive value? So I come to you today, I'm a critic, I'm a curmudgeon, I'm a bit of a fortune teller. But I ask you to get prepared for the new world of supply chain, to make that leap, to learn from the last 30 years so you can unlearn to relearn. Because I think we're all about defining new processes. And I think an important process is demand sensing. What questions do you have for me?
So, I mean, some of this stuff, obviously, you've had a position like this for a while, right? Do you see any change?
The change in technologies, the change in organizations, the change.
The change in, yeah. I mean, so, you know, I grew up in the write your own supply chain tool era, right? Then you went to the best of breed, then you had sort of the monolithic APO, you know, crush the innovation, and then you've had sort of the, you know, like demand sensing, the bolt-ons to help fix stuff. Where do you see the market going?
Well, I think there are three dimensions to that question. First, they're the consultants. And I think the majority of consultants have lost supply chain knowledge and don't really understand a lot of the principles. And I think the consultants will tend to advocate large systems because they make more money and they have the benches for them. So I don't see the shift in the technologies at the consultant level, even though they engage me in a lot of discussions about the evolution of the technology. They just don't have the bench, the understanding, and quite frankly, they've lost a lot of supply chain knowledge. A lot of the very large guys, I just see do some really bad jobs on implementation. So that's the consultants. The academics are in the institutions like SCORE and APEX and CSCMP are still trying to find their way too. So I think one of the struggles is, you know, kind of our legacy APEX, CSCMP kind of theories. And that's why I write the case studies I do to try to change that paradigm. But I see a real change in the early adopters. So companies like Procter & Gamble, companies like that are here, where they understand what drives value, and they're starting this next evolution of, you know, really looking at pattern recognition, cognitive learning, artificial intelligence, new forms of visualization. And that's where we're going to see the next wave of history being written by those pioneers. And I think it takes courage. It took courage for Dick Clark to push Terra technology at Procter & Gamble. I would encourage you to have technology, and if I can help you to have courage to push that technology, give me a call. But that's how I see it. How about yourself?
So I'm going to ask you another question then. So 2006, right?
Yep.
We imagined that was the start of using all the retailer data to synchronize your supply chain, do demand sensing, all that stuff. 9-10 years in, it's, you know, it's still early adopters. There hasn't been kind of the, you know, the revolution. Is it still coming?
So the use of point of sale data and channel data got waylaid by use of the data in the sales account teams. So we had the growth of the sales account teams in companies, and we've been very marketing driven over time, right? We've had very strong marketing practices. And the sales account teams and the marketing teams were sort of fighting it out. The downstream data came into the sales team, and the sales team looked at how I can improve sales account plans. And the marketing team, because they had syndicated data and they didn't see an issue with syndicated data, didn't really embrace the use of downstream data. We actually have digital path to purchase programs that are going on right now in about 4% of companies where that's being rethought. But the supply chain leaders, by and large, had so many other things going on. They had their SAP upgrades, they had the race for the global supply chain. They didn't really have time to really rethink outside-in practices and use downstream data. So the vendors that we have today for downstream data sort of stopped at the sales organization. Now, use of downstream data requires us to re-implement forecasting and to redefine supply chain excellence outside in. And one of the barriers was the lack of forecasting systems to use pattern recognition on downstream data and the value propositions for that. We're just starting that, right? And I think there's a lot of promise there. And I've seen a lot of promise in some high-tech and electronics companies. I'm hoping that CPG companies can get on with it, because downstream data was invented in the 1980s, right? And we can get at least 60% of channel data today for North America. So I hope, yeah.
Fascinating as always to hear your insights on things, and I kind of spent the last 30 minutes being terrified and excited at the same time. So that's
Okay, well, control your belly button and ask me your question.
So you mentioned the demand-driven thing, and you've been reporting and speaking about that for 10 years or so. I've detected in my inbox over the last probably 6 to 9 months more and more chatter on the SCM world, the supply chain 24/7, supply chain brain, you know, all the kind of industry emails that hit me each day or each week. What's kind of driving the current upshift in comms on that topic right now?
So we have a lot of people writing about demand-driven. The kind of the magic carpet of ERP implementations has dried up, right? The number of APO implementations is drying up. Consultants need a place to go to do work. But I do a lot of writing about how many people really understand the concepts of demand-driven. There are some promising technologies and approaches that are out there. The demand sensing is one, the Demand-Driven Institute is another, but they need to coalesce. And so we need to be able to bring those together. And we have to do it outside in, not inside out. And so when you see all of that press stuff come to you, you should ask yourself 3 questions. Does this embrace the independent, not dependent demand signal? Secondly, does it help you reduce demand latency and improve demand translation to cut down the time for translation of demand? And third, is it enterprise class? Is it usable, right? Because we have a lot of concepts that aren't necessarily usable. And so you got to ask yourself those questions. We're still very early in the adoption of true demand-driven processes, and one of the barriers has been the slow adoption of enterprise class technologies to be outside in. We're starting to see some new vendors that, you know, offer some hope there. And I think that will drive a new evolution, because companies today are stalled, but it's going to require innovators and the companies to really drive that forward. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I write a lot about the charlatans of demand-driven in my blog.
So my question is about, where does collaboration play with the metrics that matter? So for example, demand sensing, that's really about getting the data and improving your own demand signal. It's not necessarily working with channel partners. And you threw up that slide that had, you know, Walmart and some of the manufacturers. Is it going to take, you know, big partners working together to improve the holistic value chain to really drive not only their metrics to improve, but the entire channel or the entire value chain's metrics to improve? Because there's only so much you can do, and there's a lot of work that we can do inside of our own supply chain, but when we can start to change to your point, the rhythms and the cycles, you really need to involve the partners to make the improvements. So what are your thoughts on collaboration driving that improvement?
It's a great question. Thank you for asking, Dustin. So I think it has to start with a couple principles. True collaboration has a win-win value proposition that's self-sustaining, right? It's not about the carrot and stick, and most of the time we've had the stick, right? Second is, it's more than data sharing, it's really looking at outside-in processes. And the third is that it becomes a way of life. And there are very few cases in the supply chain where we've had true collaboration that's met those criteria. TSMC is an example of building a value network, Taiwan Semiconductor, that allows design sharing across the semiconductor industry. Walmart Retail Link is an example of collaboration, even though we may argue that Walmart was truly collaborative in their behaviors. Each of those added value, but I think each of you are in a position where you could drive true value network behaviors through the adoption of the new business-to-business networks that have canonical infrastructures and getting off of EDI, being able to look at your vendors and your channel and what you can do as a channel leader. I think it's a new world that offers tremendous opportunity. However, I think that change will only happen through mandates. I think healthcare, Affordable Healthcare Act will change healthcare and create value networks in a different way. I think safety, food safety, will create value networks in a new way. I think corporate social responsibility network legislation will really drive that compelling business proposition. And I think when that happens, you latch on that like you've never seen before and use it to your advantage to be able to drive what I think we should be doing anyway. But it's hard for it to really rise to the top until there's kind of a mandate. I was at a hospital the other day with a medical device manufacturer, and they were talking about collaboration, and it was with Mercy, and you know, I was talking about true collaboration, and the salesman took me to the door and said, "Oh, Laura, if we do that, then it's going to affect my bonus, and we really don't want to do that, right?" As long as we have the sales guy and the procurement guy talking about collaboration, we're never going to get out of our box. We've got to really elevate it to a bigger guiding coalition. Thanks. And I think we've got to be really critical of our own progress, right? You know, I was talking to GMA the other day about, you know, when I go to a GMA event, you know, I count the number of times I hear collaboration, but I don't see it in the numbers. Thank you for the question. And I have another question. Thank you.
Hi, Laura. Fascinating always to look at the metrics and be able to do the sort of cross-industry comparisons. I think two questions. Firstly, have you been able to segment the metrics by geography? Because when I think about, as you say, about the 30, 35 years of supply chain management, we've also seen those companies doing a lot of geographic expansion, acquisitions, organic growth, and so on. So have you been able to look at it from a geographical split? And secondly, from a segmentation standpoint, have you been able to look at it through a lens of it's like innovation? So I think of, you know, categories that are stagnant, where we're seeing sort of, you know, little to no growth, versus where we're truly innovating and growing the category versus just trying to still share game. So I'm just wondering if you've been able to segment the data via either of those two lenses.
I'm currently working on a project to be able to do that. You know, it's hard on a global multinational to peel back North America versus Europe versus Asia, and most of us have global multinationals. But I'm doing a study on organizations by region, and I'll be reporting on that in aggregate in August. And I think it'll be very interesting. My hypothesis is that we have very different behaviors in the region. And I'm really hoping that China perhaps drives a guiding coalition to really redefine supply chain excellence, sort of like the Japanese did with Drucker, right? Because, you know, the Chinese have actually asked for reprints of my book in Mandarin, which I love, right? And I'm going to be at Peking University in October. So I'm hoping that the Asians really take this to a new level. So while we're kind of slow and methodical, that they take it there. But today, Asian maturity on supply chains is very low. And the European views of the world are much more around transportation, because they grew up with the borders and crossing transportation. And North America is a little bit slowed and stalled. So I'll be reporting more about that. But, you know, it's very interesting. The what?
What about the innovation piece in terms of segmenting it, in terms of, you know, categories that are being innovated in versus categories that are just static?
Yeah, I think that companies that tend to have high margins, like Coke or Pepsi or pharmaceuticals, tend to be less innovative about supply chain. I see the companies that have lower margins to be far more innovative. I think that when supply chain matters more, you know, I've got to get a cold chain product to market, or I've got a short life cycle, we tend to see the most advanced supply chain processes. So I see the most advancement in high-tech and electronics, semiconductor, and companies with low margins.
Hi, Laura. Fascinating presentation.
Thank you.
I'm asking myself, there is a new generation of digital native people coming now to companies. Do you see any difference in their attitude to learn, unlearn, or does it limit itself to their Facebook capabilities, or are they embracing technology faster now than the generation before?
I think the digital natives are pretty frustrated, right? Many times they can't even get past the firewall in their own organization. And I'm hoping that, you know, supply chain leaders can embrace the digital natives and really talk about unstructured data, talk about sensing in new ways, and talk about the redefinition of supply chain processes. But I'm fearful, because we have this belief we've got best practices, that we're going to try to force our best practices that haven't gotten us very well down the throats of the digital natives. I did a webinar the other day with Costa Coffee that's actually used the Internet of Things for replenishment on their barista machines in Europe, where every time you get a cup of coffee, it does a cumulative signal and it gives a real-time signal for replenishment. And the 31-year-old Chris talked about how difficult it was to sell that project within his organization. And it's a good webinar for you to hear his story, because he could have easily have been shut down. And it was only because he was tenacious that he got it approved. And then it only got approved as a pilot, and it kept getting, you know, threatened to be shut down. So I think that there's a lot of issues with us being able to embrace the digital natives.
When it comes to the balance metrics, I think that it's so intuitive that this is a really important thing from a business perspective. And there's so much focus on the operational excellence of the different silos. When you're bringing these charts forward to senior management, what kind of reaction do they have? Is it an aha? Are they taking action on it? Or are they just saying, oh, that's kind of nice, thank you very much? Do they see this as a call to action?
You know, I reviewed all of the charts with people before I published the book. The book is 3 years of research, 9 months of writing, and 4 months of editing. And editing a book's like getting a root canal in every tooth about 4 times. And I would show leaders their orbit charts, right? And it would be sort of like dogs watching TV. They'd be like, really? Let's see now. What does that look like? What does that mean, right? It's a whole new way of looking at it, right? So I think there's this belief that we have best practices, that we've made a lot of improvement. The orbit charts are really a different way of looking at things. They're curious, but it's taken them a while to really be able to get it ingrained in their thinking. And I think we're so used to looking at data in spreadsheets without looking at the interrelationships and the patterns that that's hard. And I think it's part of the translation of supply chain to finance and finance to supply chain. So everyone I've shown them to has difficulty with them. But slowly I'm starting to see people, you know, call me and write to me about, could I see mine? And what do you think this means? And I think it's part of the socialization of the book. And the book's been in the top 100 of, you know, economics and commerce for the last 7 months. And so I think it's starting to get more adoption, but it's really new.
Okay. Are there any suggestions for the folks in the rooms for when they're having this discussion, when they're showing these charts to people, to get them to think about, here are some of the changes that we might be able to affect?
Yeah, the 3 things I would say is tell a story. Each of the charts have a story. Do you remember when we made this change? And look at this change to the balance sheet, right? Remember our merger and acquisition. Remember our outsourcing. Remember our new product. Try to make a story. Don't talk in supply chain acronyms, right? Talk about the value. Second is compare yourself to competitors and look at divisional progress. I plotted 27 divisions of one company. It was a fascinating discussion. We did a global strategy day and we put them up, and people were able to compare and share and learn from each other in a different way. So compare against competitors, compare against your own divisions, and look at your aggregate trends. And third, and this was a hard thing for me to learn, and you actually will see that I changed my posture in my writing, supply chain progress on this complex system as a portfolio happens in small increments. And it's hard for an organization to be patient. And you've got to train the organization that you move this supply chain portfolio together in small increments. And you've got to train their mental models that it isn't just a step change and it's not something that happens overnight. And you got to plot it and you got to market it. And I think we're not very good at marketing. I was doing a case study of Sean Immis of Syngenta the other day in Basel. And he was talking about he had come from the marketing organization into supply chain. And he said, one of the most difficult things to teach supply chain leaders is how to market their own projects. And I think that's a lot of truth in that. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah, and Church and Dwight had a great example of how to market internally
Yeah?
yesterday. So that's great.
Good.
Thank you.
So for people that want to know more, I'm doing a conference in September, and Terra is going to be there, and it's really around the evolution of new technologies and economists. And I'm launching a new community for people to enjoy, which will happen this summer. It's called Beat Fusion, the superfood for the supply chain. It's free and available for everyone, and I'll have benchmarking in it. And if you want to stay in touch with me, this is how you find me. These are my blogs, and just a little bit about my history. I write for Forbes, I write for LinkedIn, I write on the Supply Chain Shaman, and I'm working on my next book, which is called Leadership Matters, where I'm actually interviewing leaders about their supply chain journey. I'll be in the back of the room if you want to talk to me at break. I'd love to have the dialogue. Thank you very much.